Imagine running for your life through a dark, eerie forest with an unrelenting, monstrous creature hot on your heels. Just when you think you've escaped, something even worse waits for you in the shadows. What if I told you this isn't just a nightmare? It's a true crime story that has shocked everyone. Stick around till the end to discover the twisted secrets lurking in the woods and the real monsters hiding just beneath the surface. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. The moon hung low over Minnesota, its pale glow barely piercing the dense fog. The woods were eerily quiet. No chirping crickets. No rustling leaves. Just silence. Officer Kelly adjusted her flashlight, the beam slicing through the misty air. Her breath came in short, visible puffs, each one a reminder of the freezing temperature. The radio crackled on her hip. Static. Then a voice. Proceed with caution, it warned. She already was. Her boots crunched softly against the frost-bitten ground as she moved deeper into the forest. A call had come in an hour ago. A hiker had heard screams. Not human, they claimed. Something guttural. Primal. Kelly didn't believe in monsters, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Every step made her heart pound louder. The beam of her flashlight caught a glimmer, a metallic sheen on the ground. She knelt, fingers trembling, to inspect it.
Blood. Fresh.
A streak leading into the shadows. She rose quickly, her pulse quickening, hand on her holstered weapon. Dispatch, I found a blood trail, she whispered into her radio. The static replied, swallowing her words. The woods seemed to close in around her. Branches loomed like skeletal fingers, casting jagged shadows. She followed the trail, her flashlight shaking slightly in her grip. Then she heard it. A low growl. It wasn't far. Her breath caught. Another growl, this time closer. Her stomach churned. She could feel the vibration in her chest. Adrenaline coursed through her as she unholstered her weapon. Show yourself, she shouted, voice cracking. The growl stopped. Silence again. For a moment, she thought she was alone. Then she saw them.
Eyes.
Glowing yellow. Watching her from the darkness. Her heart thundered in her chest. The eyes blinked. Moved closer. And closer. Something shifted in the shadows, the outline of a massive figure emerging. Her flashlight sputtered, flickering, leaving her in momentary darkness. When the light returned, the figure was gone. But the growling wasn't. It was behind her now. Kelly spun around, her flashlight swinging wildly through the dark. The growl was guttural, wet, like something alive and hungry. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The beam of light landed on nothing but trees and fog. But the sound, closer now, echoed in her ears. Her hand tightened on her gun. Stay back, she yelled, voice trembling. The forest seemed to mock her. Branches creaked overhead, the sound almost like laughter. And then she felt it, the faintest brush of air against the back of her neck.
Hot. Foul.
It stank of rotting meat and damp earth. She whirled around, her finger on the trigger. Her light caught a glimpse, just a glimpse.
Teeth.
Jagged and stained. A flash of matted fur, impossibly black against the night. The creature disappeared before her brain could process it. Her chest heaved as panic clawed at her throat. Dispatch, she screamed into her radio. I need backup.
Now.
Silence. The static hissed like it was mocking her desperation. A branch snapped to her left. She turned, aiming the gun, but her hands were shaking too much to steady her shot. She felt small, exposed. The fog thickened, swirling around her like ghostly tendrils. Another sound, this one worse. A wet, ripping noise. Something dragging. She didn't want to look, but her body moved on instinct. Her flashlight landed on the source. A deer, or what was left of it. Its lifeless eyes stared at her, its body torn open, entrails spilling onto the forest floor. The smell hit her like a punch to the gut. Kelly gagged, staggering backward. Behind the carcass, something moved. A shadow taller than any man. It crouched low, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, she thought it was broken. But no, it wasn't the flashlight. It was the creature, moving faster than her eyes could follow. A low snarl ripped through the air, and Kelly's body screamed at her to run. But her legs felt like lead. The creature lunged. Kelly dove to the side, barely escaping the blur of motion. The creature slammed into the tree where she had stood, the impact sending bark and splinters flying. She hit the ground hard, her flashlight rolling out of her grasp. Darkness swallowed her. Her gun was still in her hand, but her fingers fumbled to steady it. The growling surrounded her now, circling as if the shadows themselves had come alive. She scrambled, crawling toward the faint glow of her flashlight. The ground was cold and damp, the earth clinging to her hands like it wanted to pull her under. Another snap of a branch. A hiss, low and menacing, from somewhere just ahead. Her fingers found the flashlight. She yanked it toward her and turned it on. The beam cut through the dark, and there it was. The creature. Towering, hunched, its long limbs splayed out like a grotesque spider. Its eyes burned like molten gold, locked onto her with a terrifying hunger. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one glistening with something too dark to be saliva. Kelly screamed, raising her gun, her arm trembling as she aimed. She fired. The gunshot cracked like thunder, deafening in the silent woods. The creature flinched, its body jerking as the bullet struck its shoulder. But it didn't go down. It let out a scream, a high-pitched, bone-chilling wail that made her ears ring. The sound was wrong, unnatural, like metal scraping against metal. Kelly scrambled to her feet, adrenaline overriding her fear.
She ran.
Her boots pounded against the frozen ground, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The forest seemed endless, every tree a mirror of the last, every shadow hiding another horror. Behind her, the creature roared, its heavy footsteps shaking the earth. It was faster, much faster. The underbrush tore at her legs, branches slashed at her face, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She spotted a clearing ahead, a faint light beyond the trees. Hope surged in her chest. But as she burst into the clearing, her heart sank. It wasn't safety. It was worse. The clearing was empty, save for one thing. A dark figure standing in the middle, motionless. A man. His clothes were torn, stained with dirt and something darker. He stood unnervingly still, eyes fixed on her as she stumbled into the open. Kelly's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" she gasped, then stopped herself. Something wasn't right. The man's face was pale, gaunt, his skin drawn tight against his bones. His eyes empty, cold. Then she realized the man was no man. Not anymore. His skin was slick, almost glistening under the pale light of the moon. His mouth opened, too wide, and revealed rows of teeth. But there was something else. Behind him, in the mist, more figures began to appear. Shadows that slithered and twisted, like creatures of the dark. Her heart raced. She stumbled back, the weight of the gun in her hand seeming to drag her down. The figures moved closer, their eyes glowing, and she could hear their ragged breathing. The thing in front of her stepped forward, its face contorting into something monstrous. Kelly's chest tightened, her lungs fighting for air. She swung around, trying to find another way out. But the trees seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper, thicker. Her mind screamed for escape, but her legs wouldn't move. From behind her, the growl came again. It was closer now, closer than before. She could feel it, its presence, the warmth of its breath on her neck. The air around her turned heavy, like it was pressing against her from all sides. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but she couldn't bring herself to pull it. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. She was surrounded. The growl rose again, louder this time, shaking the ground beneath her feet. And then, in a sudden blur of motion, the creature lunged forward, faster than she could react. The creature was upon her in an instant, its foul breath a hot gust against her skin. Kelly's instinct kicked in. She pulled the trigger, but the shot barely slowed it down. The creature's claws scraped across her arm, sending a jolt of agony through her body. Her vision blurred from the pain. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to scramble away. But its weight was crushing. The monstrous creature snarled in her ear, its body pressing down on hers, pinning her to the cold earth. She could feel its hot, ragged breath in her hair. The stench was unbearable, like rot and death mixed into one. Her arm burned where the claws had raked across it, blood soaking into her sleeve. It was too strong, too fast. But she refused to give up. Through the fog of pain, Kelly's hand found her gun again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She aimed for its eyes. She fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the clearing. The creature screeched, loud, piercing. It recoiled, thrashing wildly, its claws swiping at the air. For a split second, Kelly had the chance. She rolled to the side, using every ounce of strength she had left to get away. The ground beneath her was slick with mud and blood, but she didn't stop. She forced herself to her feet, ignoring the pain that screamed through her body. She ran again. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, but she pushed forward. The clearing seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around her like a tightening noose. Behind her, the creature was still there, chasing her with a fury. Its roars sent tremors through the air. Kelly's breath was ragged, but she kept running. She couldn't let it catch her.
Not now.
Not when there was a chance. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The flashing lights. The distant sound of sirens. The cavalry was here. She wasn't alone anymore. But the creature wasn't done. It wasn't going to let her go that easily. The flashing lights grew brighter, cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. Kelly's heart skipped a beat. Help was close. But the creature, its growl was louder now, relentless. It was still gaining on her. Her legs screamed for rest, but there was no time. The sound of sirens grew stronger, closer. She pushed herself harder, desperate to reach the light. Suddenly, a shout echoed from behind her. "Get down!" Kelly ducked instinctively, just as something massive shot past her. A bullet. It slammed into the creature's side with a sickening thud. The beast howled, stumbling, then crashing to the ground in a heap. Kelly's eyes locked onto the figure that had fired. A man. Another officer. He stood with his rifle raised, eyes scanning the dark. "Over here," he shouted again, motioning for her to come. Kelly didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, her muscles burning with every step. The creature wasn't done yet. It struggled to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural. But more shots rang out from behind, hitting it again and again. Each shot brought it closer to the ground, each one weakening it. The monster's roars turned to agonized screeches, but it couldn't fight the force of the bullets. It was finally slowing down. Kelly reached the officer just as the creature let out one last, defiant scream.
Then silence.
The woods felt unnervingly still. The officer lowered his rifle, his expression grim but determined. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with urgency. Kelly nodded, her body trembling, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows. The creature was down, but what if there were more? The officer's eyes scanned the darkened forest.
"Stay close," he said.
"We'll get you out of here." Kelly's heart beat in her chest, but there was no time to rest. They began to move through the trees, the eerie stillness of the woods now interrupted by the sound of their footsteps. As they walked, Kelly couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The forest was thick with shadows, the trees like dark sentinels watching her every move. Was it over? Or had they just barely escaped something far worse? The air felt thicker now, pressing against her as they moved deeper into the woods. The officer's footsteps were steady, but Kelly couldn't shake the unease in her chest. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a branch felt amplified. She glanced over her shoulder again, her eyes scanning the dark, waiting for another movement, another sound. Nothing. But still, the sensation lingered. The officer led her forward, his rifle still raised. There were others with him, more officers, scattered through the woods, keeping watch. They reached the edge of the clearing, the flashing lights now visible through the trees. The relief was almost overwhelming. But just as they neared the safety of the light, Kelly heard it again.
The growl.
It was faint at first, but unmistakable. She froze, her heart jumping into her throat. The officer beside her tensed, his eyes darting around. "We need to move now," he barked, his voice urgent. But Kelly couldn't move. The growl came again, louder this time. It wasn't the same creature. No, this one was closer. It was watching them. She could feel it. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the forest. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts. Then through the trees she saw it, a shape, more shadow than substance, lurking at the edge of the clearing. And there, in the center, a pair of glowing eyes locked onto hers. The officer didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle again, aiming at the figure. But the creature wasn't alone. Behind it, more eyes, glowing yellow, red, and green, began to emerge from the darkness.
Dozens of them.
Too many to count. The air seemed to freeze. Kelly could feel the weight of their presence, their hunger. The officer fired. The shot rang out, but it was like nothing. The creatures didn't flinch. They didn't even move. Kelly's mind raced. They weren't done. The creatures had only just begun. And the worst part? They were closing in. The officer fired again, his shots echoing through the forest, but the creatures didn't retreat. They advanced. One by one, they emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting and twisting like phantoms. Kelly's blood ran cold. She could feel their eyes on her, heavy, predatory. Her hands trembled as she reached for her gun, but the weight of it felt foreign in her grasp. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The officer beside her was still firing, but the creatures weren't even flinching. They weren't afraid. The growls came louder, merging into a chorus of deep, guttural sounds that rattled her bones. From the corner of her eye, Kelly saw movement. A figure darted past her. Fast, too fast. It was another one of them. A dark shape slithered into the light, its limbs elongated, unnatural, its face twisted into a grotesque snarl. Kelly's heart raced as the creature lunged toward the officer. He didn't have time to react. The monster's claws sunk into his shoulder, and it ripped him off his feet with terrifying strength. He screamed, his cry cutting off abruptly as the creature tore into him. The sound of flesh tearing echoed through the clearing. Kelly's stomach churned. Another creature lunged at her. Instinct took over. She fired. The shot hit the creature square in the chest. It stumbled back, its howl of pain piercing the night. But it didn't fall. It didn't die. It only seemed angrier. "Run," Kelly shouted, her voice raw. But she couldn't move fast enough. The creatures closed in. She was trapped. The clearing now felt like a cage, the trees looming like silent watchers, the monsters circling her, their eyes glimmering with hunger. Kelly's breathing was ragged, panic starting to take over. She backed up, stepping on the blood-soaked earth, her heart racing, her mind scrambling for a plan. The officer had fallen silent, his body limp in the creature's grip. Kelly's breath hitched as she noticed the way the creatures were behaving. They weren't attacking all at once. They were waiting, toying with her. And then she realized something. They were toying with all of them. They weren't here for food. Not yet. They were here for something worse. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The realization hit Kelly like a blow to the chest. They weren't just hunting for food. They were hunting for fear. They were drawing it out, savoring every moment, every terrified breath. Her body screamed for escape, but the trees around her were closing in, trapping her like prey in a spider's web. The creatures circled her, their eyes glowing brighter, sharper, as if feeding off the fear radiating from her. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, each beat echoing in her ears. But she couldn't let it consume her. She couldn't let them win. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could save her. The officer's rifle was on the ground, just a few feet away, but Kelly couldn't reach it. The creatures were too close, their hulking forms too fast. She had to think, had to do something, or they would tear her apart, just like they had done to the others. The growl came again, louder this time, almost like a command. The creatures surged forward, closing the gap. Kelly's legs screamed as she spun and ran, forcing herself to move, to keep her legs from locking in fear. Her breath was ragged, but she pushed through it, weaving between the trees, trying to stay ahead of them. But she wasn't fast enough. A shadow darted in front of her, and before she could react, one of the creatures leaped at her, knocking her to the ground. Her gun slipped from her hand, skittering away into the darkness. The creature was on top of her, its claws digging into her shoulders, its breath hot and fetid against her face. She could feel its teeth, glistening in the moonlight, inches from her neck. Her heart thudded violently, every instinct screaming for survival. But the creature paused. It sniffed the air, its yellow eyes narrowing. Something was wrong. Kelly's chest heaved, every breath a desperate gasp. She fought to move, to push the creature off, but its weight was too much. And then, as if sensing the shift in the air, the creatures began to withdraw, backing away slowly, their eyes never leaving her. Kelly blinked, too stunned to understand what was happening. For a moment, the clearing fell silent. The creature on top of her let out a low, guttural growl, but it didn't attack. Instead, it turned and slunk back into the shadows, joining the others who had already vanished into the darkness. Kelly lay there, breathless, staring into the trees. Her mind couldn't make sense of it. Were they leaving? Had she somehow survived? The night was quiet now, too quiet. And then the voice came. A faint whisper. It wasn't from the creatures. It was from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper in the woods. Run. The whisper cut through the stillness like a blade, sending a chill down Kelly's spine. Run. Her body froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the creatures. It wasn't the officer, he was gone. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was an edge to it that made Kelly's blood run cold. Her eyes darted around the clearing, but the trees were as still as ever. No movement, no shadows shifting in the corners of her vision. Run. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was coming from deeper in the forest. The voice didn't belong to any human she knew. It sounded ancient, almost otherworldly. Her heart raced, but she couldn't stay still. The creatures might have retreated, but they hadn't left. Not completely. Kelly's instinct screamed at her to follow the voice, to run towards it, but fear rooted her to the spot. She glanced at the spot where the creatures had been moments before. The ground was scarred, but they were gone. Still, the feeling of being watched pressed against her, suffocating. Her legs trembled as she forced herself to stand. Another whisper floated on the breeze. Now, hurry. This time, the voice was louder, more urgent. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the forest, her feet crunching on the dry leaves and brittle twigs. The trees closed in around her as she moved, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick canopy above. Each step felt like it might be her last. The deeper she went, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches curling like gnarled fingers, reaching for her. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of movement. A soft rustling, a scraping of claws against bark. Kelly stopped dead in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. The creatures were back. This time, they were no longer in front of her. They were behind. Slowly, she turned. The darkness behind her shifted, and the glowing eyes emerged from the shadows once again. They were closing in. They had circled around, trapping her in the heart of the woods. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and her legs felt like lead. She couldn't escape. But then she heard it again. The voice. Trust me. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. A call to follow. Her eyes darted between the shadows and the source of the voice. She had no choice. With one final, desperate glance over her shoulder, Kelly turned and ran deeper into the woods. The creatures were close now, but the voice, it was guiding her. Her feet carried her faster, the sound of her breath ragged, the growls of the monsters echoing behind her. The forest seemed to warp, the trees pressing closer, but in the distance, Kelly saw it. A faint light, flickering through the branches. The light flickered again, distant but steady, like a guiding star through the oppressive darkness. Kelly's lungs burned as she pushed forward, her legs trembling with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. She had to reach it. The growls from behind her grew louder, closer, but the voice, faint yet persistent, urged her forward. Keep going. Her breath was sharp, shallow, the weight of the creature's presence pushing down on her chest, but the light was closer now. Through the thick trees, she spotted a break in the foliage, a clearing ahead, a chance. But the air around her was thickening again, heavier, as if the very woods were alive, closing in on her. She broke into a sprint, desperation surging through her veins. The light grew brighter, more defined. It wasn't a lantern or a fire. No. This light seemed to pulse with something otherworldly, its glow warm and inviting, drawing her in. The sound of the creature's steps was nearly deafening now, their heavy bodies crashing through the underbrush. But she could feel them slowing down, drawn into the unnatural calm that surrounded the light. Kelly's pulse raced as she reached the clearing. There, in the center, stood something impossibly strange, a stone structure, ancient and covered in moss, the air around it thick with a strange energy. The light emanated from within, its soft glow casting long shadows on the ground. Kelly skidded to a stop at the edge of the clearing, panting, her heart hammering in her chest. The creatures were still behind her, but they had stopped just short of entering the clearing. They circled the edges, as if reluctant to cross some invisible barrier. The voice whispered once more, softer now, like a breath in the wind. Come closer. Without thinking, Kelly took a step forward, her feet heavy but moving. The light pulled her in, and she stepped into the center of the clearing. The moment she crossed the threshold, something changed. The air felt different, lighter, clearer, as if the suffocating weight of the forest had lifted from her shoulders. The growls from behind her stopped, the creatures now eerily silent. Kelly spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The creatures had stopped moving entirely. They hovered just outside the clearing, their glowing eyes locked onto her. But they didn't step forward. They didn't dare. A sense of peace settled over Kelly, but it wasn't a relief. It was unsettling. The light grew brighter, illuminating the stone structure before her, revealing intricate carvings, ancient symbols, like warnings she couldn't quite understand. The voice called out again, this time more forceful, more present. Stay. Wait. The creatures outside the clearing remained motionless, and for the first time, Kelly felt something other than fear. She felt the weight of their hunger, their patience. They weren't leaving. They were waiting. And so was she. The clearing seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. The light around her flickered and hummed, casting strange shadows on the stone structure that stood before her. The air felt alive, charged with something ancient, something far older than the creatures surrounding her. Kelly stood motionless, feeling the weight of their gaze on her. The creatures waiting, watching, hungry but restrained. She could feel their thirst for fear, the way they fed off the terror that had gripped her earlier. But now, in this place, surrounded by the light, she felt something different, a cold, detached calmness. It was as if time itself had slowed down and the world around her had shifted into something beyond understanding. The voice echoed once more, deep and resonant. "Do not fear them." Kelly's chest tightened. She couldn't see where the voice was coming from. It wasn't from the stone structure, nor from any physical source she could find. It was as if the very forest itself was speaking to her, guiding her, protecting her. But the creatures outside the clearing were not leaving. They were still circling, their eyes glowing brighter now, their forms becoming more distinct. Their growls, low and menacing, echoed in the silence, but they did not advance. It was as though something was keeping them at bay, something she couldn't see, but could feel. And then, slowly, the creature closest to the edge of the clearing took a step back. And another. It paused, its eyes narrowing in confusion, before it turned, then another and another. One by one, the creatures began to retreat, backing away from the light, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Kelly's breath caught in her throat as she watched them leave. They weren't fleeing, not in fear, but as if they were being pulled away, unwillingly, by some unseen force. The forest felt different now, quieter. The presence of the creatures had receded, replaced by an eerie calm. Kelly stood in the center of the clearing, heart still pounding but with a strange sense of relief. The voice came once more, softer but firm. "You're safe now." For now. The creatures were gone. And for the first time, Kelly could breathe without the weight of fear pressing down on her. But deep in the pit of her stomach, something told her that the peace wouldn't last forever. Something told her that the monsters weren't gone for good. They were still watching. And one day, they would return. The clearing, now bathed in an unsettling silence, seemed to hold its breath. Kelly stood still, feeling the strange calm wash over her as the last of the creatures disappeared into the shadows of the forest. The light pulsed once, as if acknowledging her presence, and then dimmed slightly, becoming a steady glow. For a moment, Kelly simply stood there, trying to gather her thoughts, to make sense of everything she had just experienced. Her heart was still racing, but the dread that had clawed at her chest for so long had lessened. The creatures were gone for now, but that feeling, the one that had gnawed at her gut ever since she first entered the woods, hadn't fully disappeared. The forest still held its secrets, its ancient power, and Kelly knew deep down that this moment of peace was temporary. The voice spoke again, this time gentler, as though it was trying to soothe her. "You have been chosen." Kelly's mind reeled. Chosen for what? She glanced around the clearing, feeling an almost imperceptible shift in the air. She had no answers, only questions, questions that grew sharper, more insistent with each passing second. She had survived. She had escaped. But what had she escaped to? She looked up at the stone structure before her, now glowing softly in the moonlight. The symbols carved into it seemed to shift, the ancient markings telling a story she couldn't understand, but one that felt important. Vital. Her eyes traced the lines, feeling the weight of history in every etched groove. Suddenly, she heard something, a soft rustling behind her. Turning quickly, her breath caught in her throat. The creatures were back, but they weren't the same. They stood at the edge of the clearing, but now, they were not the terrifying, mindless monsters they had been before. There was something different about them. They watched her with an almost knowing expression, their eyes no longer filled with hunger, but something else, something far darker. Kelly's stomach churned as she realized that their retreat had not been a retreat at all. They had simply been waiting for her to reach this point, waiting for her to step into the center of the forest's ancient power. The voice spoke again, now filled with an almost sorrowful tone. Not all monsters are what they seem, and not all hunters are the hunted. Kelly's pulse quickened. She had no idea what this meant, what she had just uncovered. But she understood one thing. The forest, the creatures, the ancient power that had guided her through it all, had no intention of letting her go. As the creatures closed in, she realized the truth. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. And the monsters had only just begun to reveal their true faces.